Hey guys, it's Lance at Max Sound Solutions, and today I'm doing something a little different. I am presenting to you a mini documentary series. This is episode 1 with Joel Greenbaum, the owner of Evergreen Recording. This is the recording studio that I got my start at way back in the 1980s, and I haven't talked to Joel in many, many years. So it was really great catching up. There's a lot of fun stuff in this interview, lots of great stories about the studio and the artists that came through its doors. So let's get right to it. There he is. Hey, Joel, how are you?
Okay,
it's only
Lance.
been 35 years.
Only. Good to see you. You look just like I remember you, but just a little bit older.
You look the same, a little bit older, yes. 35 years to be exact, or somewhere it might be 36, I don't know.
Well, you still have all your hair.
Well, sort of. It's well groomed at the moment.
Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. So you're down in Florida now. How long have you been down there?
Been here for about 22, 23 years. After we left Manhattan, we were living in the Hudson Valley, and then moved down here when our oldest was about to start high school.
Let's get right to Evergreen. How did you come up with the name Evergreen?
Oh, very interesting. Well, of course, Evergreen was a play on my last name, Greenbaum, which in German means green tree. So that's how I came up with the name. And I think at the time it was available for however you register that in New York State. So I was able to register it.
And how did you find the space? Give us a little background on the whole scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. Backing up, I had, originally I was a musician and arranger and a composer, and I had gotten a National Endowment for the Arts grant to write this piece for jazz ensemble and orchestra. But by the time I got the money for it, I'd already written the piece and copied out all the parts. If you can imagine copying all those parts by hand. Now, we have all kinds of apps to do that sort of thing. So I already did it, and I didn't need to spend money doing it. So I said, maybe I'll buy myself a little 4-track recorder. And I was living on the Lower East Side at the time, and bought a little 4-track. I think it was a Docorder or something like that, and some microphones, and got some foam egg carton insulation and plastered it on the walls of my Lower East Side apartment, and started doing some recording. What happened is, in the interim, I met my wife, and she's also a musician. She still is a musician. She had a loft on 30th Street between 7th and 8th, overlooking the back of Madison Square Garden. And at the time, the Ramones were in the building, Blondie was in the building, Steve Gadd was directly beneath her. And everybody, of course, was rehearsing and practicing like 24/7. But other than Steve, nobody had really made it yet, so nobody could afford to soundproof their place. So it was like living in cacophony, like 24/7.
Wow!
Right. So so we decided we were going to get an apartment on the Upper West Side, and then each find a separate workspace for our, she had her piano, I had my piano, and our various, equipment and whatnot. And at that time, we got an apartment on 91st Street between Broadway and West End. And I found what ultimately became the space for Evergreen, which was a Broadway between West End and Amsterdam, in the basement of this old pre-war building. And I said, it's a little larger than I need for just kind of putting my gear in. Maybe I'll build a little recording studio. And I went to local 802, the Musicians Union. They had a credit union, and I went to the credit union, and I got somebody, to co-sign a loan for me, and I built the studio. and I knew
Wow.
nothing about what I was doing. I went to the library, I think, and took out some books on soundproofing and acoustics, and I understood a little bit about construction because my family was in the hardware business. But I had a friend at the time, Jimmy Foote, who I hired, and he had a lot of experience with construction. So we wound up building the studio. I think it took about 8-9 months to build the studio. And when I got the space, of course, it was in the basement of the building, and it was really trashed. Because, I mean, the plaster was falling off the walls, and it was infested with those big, palmetto bugs or big, water bugs. Roaches.
Water bugs.
Yeah, right. So it was really, quite a project. And, I kind of did it on a shoestring budget and started. When we designed the studio, it was a floating studio. So we used these sound isolation pucks, and then the floor was built on top of the sound isolation pucks. But then in the studio, there was this big pipe that ran down the middle, right? And then I don't remember if you remember that there was this V that came down, right? And actually, it was kind of cool for acoustic purposes because it kind of broke up, standing waves and stuff. But part of that was we were trying to build around this huge steam pipe, and so we were designing, we had this big beam that ran underneath it, and we had cantilevered these 2x4s to kind of hold it in place. And I remember when Jimmy Foote was the guy who helped me build it, when we completed it, and we had these lolly columns or just something holding it up temporarily, and we were going to, we knew nothing about structural engineering,
Right, right.
And we were wondering, is this whole ceiling just gonna? Because then it had a couple layers of sheetrock on top of it, and it was heavy. And so I remember taking the supports out and wondering whether it was going to come crashing down on us. And then I even remember coming back the next day to see, whether it had fallen down overnight.
Right.
But it hung in there. So, but the other part about it is, it was in the basement of this old pre-war building, with a doorman in uniform. So you would walk through this lobby with marble on the walls, and it wasn't like this really posh building at that point. I think it's since become posher.
Right, but the entranceway was very nice.
Yeah. And then you go down into the bowels of the earth, into the basement, where the building's laundry room is, and then just off to the right is the boiler room that's even further down below the studio.
That's right. Yeah. And so what did you start out with tracking-wise?
Started out as an 8-track studio, 1-inch 8-track. I had this old Ampex tube 8-track recorder. And this thing was a beast. I bought it from a studio up in Connecticut, and allegedly John Coltrane recorded Love Supreme on it. So that was kind of like the vibe of the equipment, with those big old tubes and stuff. And I think I had at the time, there's a guy out in Long Island named Sid Zimmett, and he had a company, I think it was called Sound Craftsman. And he was designing these consoles, and so I bought a Sound Craftsman console.
When did you go 24-track?
I don't remember exactly when, but we went from 8 to 16-track.
And that was the Ampex MM1200?
MM1200, right.
MM1200, yeah. But,
well, I don't know if you remember the Harrison at Evergreen.
I do. Let's talk about the Harrison. And where did that come from?
Oh, I think I bought it from Martin Audio. I don't know if Martin Audio is still in business, but they were the big professional audio equipment distributor in Manhattan. I don't know.
So you bought it new?
Oh, yeah, I bought it brand new. And I can't remember why I bought that. I don't think SSL had become the rage. Of course, there would have been a big price difference, of course. And then I wound up modifying it. I don't know if you remember Al Firestein. I think he had a studio called Wizard Sound, if I'm not mistaken. And so he had a studio himself, but he also was an electrical engineer and an acoustical engineer. So Al would come in and he'd tune our room. Remember, we had the big Uri speakers, and he'd blast, I guess, white noise or whatever. At incredibly loud levels, and then he had an analyzer that would analyze it, and he'd tweak it and flatten everything out via the whatever equalizer we were using. So anyway, I asked him to modify the electronics on the Harrison and remove the transformers. So he did a design for it, but then he showed me what to do, and then I did every single module.
I was there for that.
Yeah, I took it out with my soldering iron. I was removing capacitors and transformers and bypassing.
And what did that do? What did that do to improve the sound?
It opened it up because the transformers just made, and I think some of this was at Rob's encouragement, but it just opened up the sound. The transformers somewhat restricted it. Harry Belafonte had one. Harry had a loft, and his son David was an engineer. So David came in, and Harry came, with some of. I don't think we ever recorded Harry, but people like Hue Masekela came through Harry Belafonte. And this guy, John Cartwright, I think was his musical director.
John Cartwright,
right? And so he had all these South African guys also. John wasn't South African, but he had all these South African musicians that would come. And I think David was comfortable because he was familiar with the Harrison, and it was a good quality board. Yeah.
I engineered that record, actually. So I don't know who started the record, but whoever started it couldn't finish it, and that's when I stepped in and kind of did the rest of the tracking. I didn't mix it.
Well, I looked it up, and that record was the last record that Hue Masekela recorded before repatriating back to South Africa.
Africa, yeah. And actually, Hue Masekela's band were all the guys who played on Graceland.
Yep.
That was a fun record to do. He was very cool.
I love his music. And I remember the session because they recorded everything live.
Right.
And they were like, I don't know, there must have been 10 musicians in that little studio. And we had horn players in that little entryway where you come into the studio before you get to the control room. I mean, we had them like every place possible,
And there was a cloud of a familiar smell going on through the entire... Hugh used to say to me, Lance, don't be so cheap, man. And what he was referring to is, like when I worked with Lottie and Tommy, they wouldn't want a bunch of pre-roll into the punch. They wanted to be chop, chop, chop.
Yeah.
And Hugh was like, he wanted like 30 seconds of pre-roll to get in the groove, and then he'd start doing his thing. Don't be so cheap, Lance.
That's great.
And now, did Rob mix the first Chili Peppers demos there?
At that time, they were doing the dance record thing was like the big thing, right? And so they were doing remixes specifically as dance records.
I remember a picture of the Chili Peppers when I first started working there, and I had never heard of them, but I thought, what a weird picture.
Right.
And I'm
I remember that too.
Those guys look kooky.
Yes.
And that's just what I remembered. So I'm like, well, some of it must have been mixed there. Bill Laswell did a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Sure. Bill did a lot of stuff, and Herbie Hancock, Rob did a project with Herbie right after he came out with Rocket. He did the follow-up to Rocket.
Right, it was the next record after Rocket,
And then he did music for the Olympics with Herbie. Then Madonna, she was just starting to become this really hot thing in the dance club scene.
That's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Elvin Jones, the jazz drummer.
Right.
I'm trying to think who else.
Yeah.
Oh, Sly and Robbie.
Yeah,
Sly Dunbar, Robbie Shakespeare.
What project were they working on?
They did a lot of the Bill Laswell stuff.
Yeah.
Rhythm section.
And Bill did the Golden Palominos, so he had Micheal Stipe from REM,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and Johnny Rotten. I'll never forget because I worked on those sessions.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
I came in and, I'm walking from the elevator to the main hallway there.
Uh-huh.
And there's this guy sitting on the steps of the MIDI room,
Yep.
Studio B. And I look at him and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
that's Johnny Rotten. I just couldn't believe it,
Right.
Because the band I played in Texas actually opened for the Sex Pistols on the night that Sid Vicious took his bass and conked a guy over the head.
Oh, wow.
But I wasn't in the band yet. I joined him a little after that. You always get a little awestruck and you don't know what to say. I just kept my mouth shut and basically
But that
watched.
was a very weird day because I remember coming down to my office and he was hanging out. Remember we had that couch across from the MIDI room in my office. Johnny Lydon was hanging out on the couch, and on that record it was a collaboration between him and Africa Bambaataa.
Right. That's the other project they did.
Because
he did the Golden Palominos and he did Mass Destruction.
Right, Mass Destruction, right, yeah.
World destruction, your life ain't nothing. The human race is becoming a disgrace. Hebrews and Muslims, Christians and Hindus, up in the time zones searching for the truth.
Bill Laswell did such, I was saying before that I wish some of his genius washed off on me because he was so hip, He did projects that were so cool.
Right.
He was not a mainstream guy, although he did produce Mick Jagger's solo album.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember him coming in on one of his other projects. I was assisting or apprenticing, I'm not sure which. And he played Just Another Night, I think that's the name of the song, by Mick Jagger's first big single, and it had all the little tape loop breakdown at the sort of towards the end of the song, which was totally Bill's production.
Yeah, that's a Bill thing, right?
Yeah, and I was like, and he was looking around the room like this, and
yeah, and then we were talking about just some of the amenities at Evergreen, like the beer machine.
Those guys loved it. Johnny Rotten was like, they were feeding him Budweisers from the soda machine, and it's like, oh, I could get to like this. And they're like, well, maybe you want to stay one more day, and we'll put you up in the hotel, and they handed him another Bud, and he was like, I could get to like this. It's really very funny.
Let's see, who else? Meatloaf.
Yeah. Wow.
And I don't remember what he was doing, but somebody was. I don't know if it was Rob that was working with him. I think Rob also did Aaron Neville from the Neville Brothers.
That's
now
great.
Jimmy did a session because Jimmy did some engineering for me early on. He worked with this guy Don Covey. You know who Don Covey is? Don Covey wrote Chain of Fools. Aretha said, and he was also an artist himself. He wrote a bunch of songs, that you know. So he was recording with Jimmy, and Jimmy was this kind of very mild-mannered guy, and I speak about him in the past tense because he died a few years ago. But he was this very mild-mannered, really good friend. So anyway, this guy Don Covey, Jimmy's engineering the session, and he's not able to give Don whatever it is he's asking for in terms of sound or whatever he's doing. And Don picks up a stool and it's like starting to threaten to hit him with it, And then the session goes on, and he pulled out a gun and starts threatening Jimmy. Talk about working under pressure.
I told you more 100 hertz on the bass.
Oh, God. Some of those stories, crazy.
How did the whole John Lennon thing happen with Yoko bringing in those projects?
Well, that was through Rob. I think Yoko had somebody, I can't remember the guy who worked for her as a manager or something. Then, of course, it was convenient because it was near where she lived at the Dakota. And we also did a really good job of shielding people like Yoko from curiosity seekers, so
Right.
we were able to keep her presence there very low key, so she wasn't there and getting harassed by, people seeing her go into the building or onlookers or, or whatnot.
Yeah. I remember they had a guard for the tapes.
Uh-huh. Well, that was
Yeah.
the really sad thing, as I think, I mentioned. We were transferring all the 2-inch masters to digital for archival purposes. And plus, when he was in the studio, unlike most clients, because the 2-inch tape was like super, super expensive, they just let the tape roll.
Right.
I mean, so it recorded a lot of the conversations, because Yoko would be there and other, band members would be there, and we'd be having these conversations. And they found a bunch of stuff that had never been released before. I think they came out with a record called Men Love Avenue, as a result of all the stuff that hadn't been released, before. So the sad thing is that all the tapes were cataloged, one of 24, 2 of 24, 3 of 24. And then there would be big gaps in numbers because those tapes were missing. And my understanding was that, wherever they left those tapes previously, I don't know if I think they did a lot of recording back in the day at the record plant or whatever.
Yeah.
People just took them,
Stole 'em.
Yeah, that was kind of, a drag to realize how much other stuff there may have been.
Right.
That was just lost because somebody just stole them. Her manager name was Elliot somebody, can't remember his last name. So I think, however, they reached out to Rob and Rob brought them in. I don't think they did the mixing. We rented a 24 track digital machine,
Like a Sony or something?
Yeah, maybe. But then it was a real issue just because the tape, the oxide was deteriorating. So Rob had to be very careful in terms of keeping the cleaning the heads frequently and trying to minimize the number of passes when transferring stuff.
I remember I was hired to do a transfer for Paul McCartney.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if you remember that, but you rented a big digital tape machine. It might have been, I think it was a Sony, or it might have been the Mitsubishi, but it was like sitting there tilted, because it couldn't fit in the control room. And we had a snake. I had it all wired up, and it was his tour in Canada that he had done, and they were just going to transfer it to digital to make a backup. But then the phone call came in the morning when I was there. It's like, no, we're doing it somewhere else.
Oh, wow.
But I got paid for the day, and the studio got paid because it was booked, but they just wound up doing it somewhere else. And I'm like, there goes my Paul McCartney credits.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. My one Beatle credit.
Right.
Well, I did assist Rob on one of those Lennon sessions, just one, though.
What's Rob up to? Because I kind of have lost.
Well, he did like the last John Lennon box set, which has a bunch of raw mixes. I mean, I didn't get into it too much with him, but I've looked at what he's been doing, and he said he was just doing like promo for that. Like did an interview about it. How did Rob get involved with you in the early days?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not quite sure, but I think Yvonne Sewell, who was a studio manager at the time, she was great at networking, and I think she maybe made a connection with Rob. And Rob also lived on the Upper West Side, so it was really convenient for him to not have to, to go to Midtown
trek downtown,
to do work. As you know, as an engineer, once you know the room and how it translates, from when you take stuff outside the room, then you develop a certain comfort level.
I spoke to Rob, which I was quite nervous about.
Really? I remember he could be kind of an intimidating guy.
Well, he was always intimidating to me. Right. And, not in a negative way or anything, but he was always intense. He was a great mentor, and I know for Lothar, he definitely was. Lothar assisted a lot of sessions with him before he moved up to engineer.
Right.
And tried to get in touch with Han Rowe. But he hasn't responded yet. A couple of other names I'm going to throw at you. Bob Kirshner.
Right, I
I
saw
don't know
that
if
name.
you.
Yes, I remember
Yeah,
him. I had forgotten about them until I saw his
Yeah,
name.
I had
Yeah,
forgotten about him too, and then it just some of these names clicked into my brain, and I'm like, oh yeah, Bob and Dan Richards. Do you remember
I
him?
do.
I think he reached out to me out of the blue on Facebook, so he was like my first Evergreen connection in a while, except for maybe Andrea Bella.
Right.
She and I and Tommy Farragher were going to get together,
Mm-hmm.
and then Tommy had something come up and he couldn't do it. So, and then that was that. But I reached out to her again, and she got back to me, and she's
Well, I
in the
hope you give
film
everybody my
industry.
regards. Yeah.
Oh, I will.
Yeah.
And everybody's going to see this in the end. You know, if nothing else, it's like a family reunion video.
Yeah.
How did you connect with Yvonne in the first place? Yvonne sort of seemed to remember that you contacted her.
I honestly
bring
don't
her in, but
remember.
Neither one of you seem to remember exactly how it happened.
And I have a feeling that knowing Yvonne, because she's a real go-getter, right? I mean, she's all about networking and making connections. I have a feeling that she must have reached out. And, I mean, she did such a great job. I mean, she was the perfect person. I was really heartbroken when she left. I mean, I didn't take it personally, but I mean, I understood why she needed to leave. You know, she had kids that she had to support, and she had, opportunities. But she really, made a lot of that stuff happen and made sure that once people got in there, that they were well taken care of.
Evergreen's Apprentice program paid just $5 a day. You kept the studio clean, made a lot of coffee, took food orders, helped set up sessions, were able to sit in on sessions, and in return got a free engineering class on Saturdays, and you were allowed to use the studio during off hours. You learned studio etiquette, and you got to be a fly on the wall during sessions with pro producers and engineers working with great musicians, making records. Priceless. Everybody I talked to is always like, Joel was so open to allowing people to use the studio. I mean, that's how you really learned back then.
Yeah.
You had the class on Saturdays, which was free. Mm-hmm. And the guy teaching the class was Peter. I don't remember his last name. Do you? I think he worked at NYU, and he would come up and do classes. The class, rotated whose song they would record next. Like if somebody in the class was a musician, they'd pick them to. So I got to do one of those recordings.
Cool. It's interesting that you bring that up, because when I started the studio, that was the same time when a lot of the colleges were offering a course of studies in, audio engineering. And it just struck me that, people are spending a ton of money on this education, and they're still going to have to come out and make coffee and sweep the floors and work their way up. I just figured it was a great alternative to offer people. Of course, it served the studio well because I got extra help, but I also felt that, there had to be a quid pro quo for that, that they had to get something out of it. So I used to make the studio available for people to work on their own projects. And that's how Lothar got his record deal. And there were other people that did stuff. I know Han was, did a number of projects on his own.
Well, we recorded our whole first album there, pretty much. Mm-hmm. Two songs we did at another studio, but the Horse You Rode In On was the name of my band. I put in a lot of time at the studio at open time because you allowed us to, and that was a huge benefit. My engineering chops really came from me working on my own music, because when you're assisting, you're not mixing somebody's stuff, you're just helping out on the sessions, aligning the machines and whatnot. And we got the best unsigned band at the New York Music Awards 1989.
Wow.
For our 4-song demo, which had a cover of Mrs. Robinson.
I think I remember that.
Yeah, it's very
it was kind of a punk version, wasn't it?
This one's for you, Mrs. Robinson. Jesus loves you more than you will now.
I took that demo to a guy at Atlantic Records, and an A&R guy, because a friend of my dad's set up this meeting for me. I played it for him, and he was like, "Why would you ever want to cover that song? That's that's a classic. You can't cover classics like that.
You can't?
And-
like, everybody covers classics.
That's right. Next thing you know, the Lemonheads on Atlantic Records came out with their version of Mrs. Robinson. I was like, that's odd how that all went down.
Yeah, right?
On the night of the New York Music Awards, it was at the Beacon Theater. Lou Reed handed us our award.
Wow.
The Ramones played that night. Brenda K-Star played that night, who I did a record with Lottie and Tommy.
Yes,
so when she came out in this flowing white outfit, I'm like, it's Brenda. It was fun. Like, for me, it was like there was never a day I felt like I'm working.
Yeah.
You know, I was just always learning. Lothar and Han were both great at, like, teaching extra stuff when you had a question or you were stuck, you know.
Yeah.
Rob did a thing to me where he's doing edits on one of his mixes, and then he had to go to the bathroom or something. He says, "You cut that," and he walked out of the room, and I'm like, "Oh shit! What if I screw up?" But I cut it, and it was okay. You know, we learned
Trial
editing,
by
but
fire.
you had to know so much more technical stuff. I mean, now the technology is completely different. But learning the tape machine alignment, and, you know, people don't realize, like, what went into just a session before it starts. The setup, the alignment of the tape machines, not just the multi-track, but the 2-track, how you power everything up in the room. And I think there was a checklist of stuff that you went through.
I think so.
For the
I'd forgotten about
assistants.
that, but I think
they
you're
got
right.
it right. It just popped into my head.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that.
A lot of people got their start at Evergreen and continued to flourish from there.
There were a lot of people that really were able to, you know, take advantage of that and really kind of cut their teeth, so to speak.
And you were just nice and open. A lot of studios would not do that.
You know, I really always felt like I got a lot in return. I mean, you guys didn't get paid a lot, you know.
$5 a day,
right? So,
for Apprentice, which was something.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
It covered the toll and the gas for me back then, probably.
Wow.
You know.
Yeah.
I remember I was on unemployment. That's how I got into the whole thing. And I came and met you, and you're like, instantly, you were like, you go talk to Yvonne. She's down there, studio manager. And I talked to her, and she's like, it's $5 a day. This is what you'll be doing.
Right.
And we need you 2 days a week for starters or whatever, you know. And then it turned into 4 days a week I was coming down. And then I was there on the weekend doing the class, so it was like 5 days a week.
Right.
Commuting in this car that could barely, you never knew if it was going to make it.
Right.
You know? And then when my unemployment ran out, I'd been doing the apprenticeship for 6 months. And I'm like, Joel, I've got to get a job. You've got to start putting me on sessions as an assistant. I literally started crying, and it worked. Next week, I was assisting on a session, and there was like 6 of us apprentices at the time, something like that. Carol was another apprentice.
Carol. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember Carol.
There was a lot of us, and I was desperate to get that job. And I know Carol started assisting also probably around the same time I did. And because Lothar and Han had moved up, so there were only like 1 or 2 open slots for an assistant. You know? My breakdown helped me.
You know, I lived in the building. And occasionally when there was a maintenance issue that would come up in a session that whoever was on, you know, couldn't handle, I'd get a call and I'd take the elevator down. So I get in.
Channel 23 is down.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. So I come into the room. It's maybe 11 o'clock at night. And I walk into the room, and the room is filled with guys. It must have been like a dozen people in the control room, all in leather and chains. I mean, of course, this was in the dance, you know, record era with like village people and, you know, and whatnot. So, but the session was totally stopped. So I had a captive audience, and I walk into the control room, and of course everybody's waiting because nobody can work. And I look at the console, and where the master fader was, I just took my hand and went bam, and everything started working again. And I said, oh, I guess it just likes to get hit in the right spot. And they started cracking up.
I think I remember that there was a certain hit you had to do every once in a while.
Right?
Maybe
some bad contact or something, you know.
Let's talk gear just for a minute. Like, you guys had the Lexicon 200 digital reverb, and then you got a 224, I believe.
Okay, could be.
You remember
I mean,
those?
this is all stuff that, not having been in the industry in a while.
Yeah,
I do
remember the
my
Lexicon 200. That was like the gated reverb sound.
Yep,
and
that was
everybody
big.
was using the hell out of that in the 80s, you know.
Yeah. We also had, what was that really wild one with all the sound effects?
With the Eventide?
Maybe the Eventide, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And then we also had an actual the plate. We had a plate.
You had
we had
the
a plate
in
reverb.
the back room.
Yep.
Yeah.
We had a plate reverb.
Yep.
I don't know if people really used that much after.
I used it.
Uh-huh.
I think people did use it quite a bit.
Well, I got to tell you, I just remembered a funny story because we started out and you asked me about how we came up with the name, Evergreen. Many years later, I get a call from Evergreen Studios in California, which
LA,
was like
yeah.
in LA, I think. It was a big studio and, threatening to sue me for using the name and all this crazy stuff.
Yeah.
It was totally two different states. I mean, I totally, had the name registered and had the corp.
Yeah.
So it was crazy. But what I understood from their operation was that Barry Manilow would have his own parking space there with his name on it, right? So like that they would do stuff like that. So I sent him a picture of the front of the building on 91st Street, with like one of the dumpsters that people would put on the street,
Right.
And I just said, here's how we give our, customers their reserved parking space.
Next to the dumpster. That's funny.
You mentioned getting out at the right time. I don't know if there's really ever a right time to get out because it was increasingly challenging. I think the biggest challenge at that time was that companies like Tascam were coming out with semi-pro equipment. And I think the biggest challenge that I faced is, as you know, I tried to run the studio as a real professional, studio where we aligned the machines and, I had the room tuned and, tried to keep up with maintenance and all that stuff and provide technical support. But then when the semi-pro manufacturers like Tascam started coming out with equipment, and the nature of the music, you had your rappers and dance music and stuff. People were making records in their bedroom, and the sound quality, the difference in acoustics or the difference between recording with a limited bandwidth versus, what you would get in a professional studio became less important to the artists and the producers at the time. And I never faulted them for it. I mean, but it became increasingly difficult to operate a business based on where you had, as you remember, we would provide an engineer and an assistant engineer for every session.
Yeah.
And the cost of maintaining and staffing and all those things, as opposed to people would come in and then, so they would record their tracks in their bedroom and then they would call up the studio and want to book time. They didn't know any better to know, well, who's the engineer, what are their credentials, what is the equipment, is it maintained, is it calibrated? And so it really just became about price. And at that point, it wasn't as fun anymore when you have, in my opinion, like a full service business that where people no longer value the service that you provide. And the criteria, is just different. It was just different. I was reaching a point where, I did it for a long time.
Yeah.
I've been very lucky and really throughout my life to be able to do things that I enjoy and am passionate about. And that was one of them until I wasn't.
Until you weren't.
Right. Yeah. Because I started doing some volunteer work for different, nonprofit organizations. And I just felt like I wanted to reconcile my social conscience with, my, work skills. And so I just kind of moved on in another direction. Plus, I mean, it seemed like every other day there was some new gizmo, gadget coming out that everybody had to have for their session. And so,
keeping up with all the keyboards and the drum machines and all that stuff.
And the processors, all the various processors,
all the outboard gear. And also, SSLs became the number one console people were mixing on.
That's right.
So keeping up with that whole automation scene was another
That's right.
thing for everyone wanted to mix on SSLs. So it was really great to see you again, Joel, and I got to thank you for all your mentorship and, being such a positive, open person in the studio, letting us all come in. And a lot of the people made major careers from their start at Evergreen. So I got to thank you for that.
Well, thanks, Lance. I mean, it's really heartening to know that because, as I mentioned, I kind of do something and I just kind of go full out and, that's something I'm passionate about. And then, I move on to the next phase of my life. So it's been a long time since I've really thought about the studio. And of course, I've lost track of a number of the people. So it's really great to hear about this whole, community of people that got their start and were able to make lives, out of it. So, so that's awesome. Thank you for this opportunity to go down memory lane and hear and catch up with what a lot of people are doing.
On that note, I'll say goodbye. Great to see you, Joel, and hopefully we'll stay in touch from here on out.
I hope so. I really do.
Stay tuned for episode 2 with Yvonne Sewell, studio manager of Evergreen and also author of High on Rebellion, Inside the Underground at Max's Kansas City.